thought what might be appropriate tonight is to look at the subject of voting, elections, leadership, that sort of thing. Like everything else, there's a Torah approach to these things. So let's try to study a little bit of the attitude, perhaps, that one should have to some of the issues that are involved. Many questions. Voting itself. What does that do? Should you vote? And does it make any difference, really, who's elected? What is leadership, really, from a Torah perspective? What is the view we should have about democracy altogether? These are things that affect us very, very immediately. But let's try to do it at a level worthy of Torah, understand the things more deeply if we can. First of all, the practical side, I think, is that these things really don't make much difference to us. Or, more accurately, what does make a difference is what's going on behind the scenes. The face that happens to be on the poster or elected, the face, the personality, that's really only a face of something deeper. In other words, when things happen politically, the correct Jewish attitude is, what's Hashem saying to us? He's saying it through the medium of the political system. He's saying it through the medium of the people that he pushes forward to be ostensible leaders. But a tragic mistake is to think that the real issues are vested in the people. It's not to say they're not responsible, of course. They are responsible. But the real message is the message that's being delivered from behind the scenes, and that really is to be measured in terms of what we deserve. We get what we need, we get what we deserve. Right? We don't get what some individual foists on us because he wants to be a leader. We get the leader, or the so-called leader, that we need and deserve. The one way to see this very clearly is that there's a principle that when a person achieves major political power, the irony or the paradox, if you like, is that it feels like, and it seems to them, and it seems to the world, as if that person has achieved real power. But the Torah teaching is that when a person achieves a position of significant power, major political power, he loses all free will. The verse that determines this, or that dictates this, is Leiv Melachim V'Sarim B'Yad Hashem. The heart of kings and princes, or kings and ministers, meaning anyone of major political power, a king or a prime minister, or ministers, princes, whatever that means. Where the exact cutoff is, what sort of power you have to have, I don't know. But people who are clear leaders, their hearts are really in the heart of Hashem. Leiv Melachim V'Sarim B'Yad Hashem. The hearts of leaders like that is in Hashem's hand. I don't think it means that they don't have free choice at all, although that's also possible. When Pharaoh, as a leader, misused his free will enough, it got taken away from him. That doesn't only apply to a leader. A person who so perverts their freedom of will, who so badly insists on using it wrongly, so stubbornly and so often, you could so contaminate it and so pervert it that you lose it. By the way, that happens on the good side too. If you train yourself and use your free will time and again correctly, eventually you will lose it on the good side. And you won't be able to sin or fall, even if you'd like to, or even if you tried. Because things always work in balance in the spiritual world. The classic example of that is Joseph, right? The two counterpoints here of Pharaoh, who so repeatedly and so stubbornly and so brazenly and so foolishly kept behaving negatively, even though he was doing it in the face of clear proofs that he was wrong. He knew he was battling none other than the Creator himself. And eventually, after doing that a number of times, Hashem said, I'm now going to make a fool out of you and use you and no longer allow you to manifest your free will. Actually, there are two interpretations of that, two classic interpretations. One is that God took away his free will. And the deep interpretation is he gave back his free will so he could continue choosing wrong. In other words, the sensitive way to understand that is, there comes a point in the process of history, that means when a person is so stubbornly using his free will so badly and so wrongly, and he keeps getting hit so badly, his whole nation is experiencing plagues, eventually, unless he's completely psychotically detached from reality, he's going to get the message. Sooner or later he's going to get the message. And after enough plagues had happened that Pharaoh definitely had got the message, there's no way that he could have chosen evil after that. I mean, there has to be a limit. So what Hashem did, according to some deep interpretations, is what Hashem did was not that he took away his free will, he gave him the free will to continue making wrong decisions. Because, is this clear? He'd reached a point where, left to his own devices, he'd been hit so badly so many times, there's no way he could have chosen wrong after that. You have to be a complete idiot to do that when you see your country disintegrating in front of your eyes. So what Hashem did was strengthen his free will so that his natural resistance and his natural negativity could come through and he would still be free to choose which is wrong. But however you put that, whichever angle you choose to take on that, he was denied, or his free will was interfered with, let's put it that way, to the extent that he could continue to self-destruct. That can happen to a person. And on the good side, of course, you have Joseph. Joseph was a youngster, he was 17 years old, when he found himself in the house of a woman who tried to seduce him every day. The Talmud goes into the most, I can't repeat the details, it's not too squeamish, the details. What she did to try to seduce him in a sensual way, in the most extreme fashion. He was a 17-year-old in the height of his adolescent passions. And day after day he resisted her. She was a married woman. And he resisted. And eventually she wore him down. Eventually she got into a point where he couldn't resist anymore. And at the moment that he weakened and decided that he would sin with her, at that moment a vision of his father's face appeared at the window, reminding him of who he really was. And at that moment he fled. Without his clothes. She had his clothes in her hands. And he was caught in a very suggestive situation without his clothes, and he was lucky to survive with his life. But you see, what happened there was he used his free will so correctly so many times that eventually he lost it on the good side. Eventually, when he failed, so to speak, and he weakened, and he was about to lose his grip on his spiritual perfection, then because he'd made the right decision so many times, that investment in his free will saved him. And even when he at that moment was not strong enough, the investment and the momentum, if you like, that he built up, the power that he built up in his sanctity, his kedusha, that saved him in a way that he wouldn't have been strong enough at that point. In other words, you could lose your free will on the bad side, you could lose it on the good side. Investment, and there's other examples as well. Meshech famously says that Moses eventually lost his free will. He reached such a level of spiritual perfection that eventually he was unable to choose wrong. He became semi-divine. Half of him was lifted into another world. And from that time on, he couldn't make a mistake. The famous questions on this, because it was after that he struck the rock. So how could he make a mistake if we learn that he had no free will? And the answers to that, he made the mistake of an angel, which is a very refined technical mistake, but he no longer had the tension of a lower self pulling him down. But when a person becomes a political leader, then the principle is that Hashem, whatever his choices are, Hashem is manipulating. Again, I'm not sure whether Hashem manipulates the choices or he manipulates the output. That means the person can still choose to be malicious and evil and propagate a Holocaust. He can choose to do that. But whether the result occurs or not is not up to him. That means even if you take the line that we are free to hurt each other, which itself is a fascinating debate, and we'll get an opportunity, we'll go through that in detail. But despite that debate, that means even if you hold that we are free to harm each other, that means my free will can impinge on you and do to you what you don't deserve, even if you hold that opinion. But not when you're a king. A king or a prime minister, somebody of that level of political power, can only foist his free will on the masses to the tune that they invoke, that they deserve, that they have coming. Right? Nobody's free to do that. No one's free, not only political leader, no one's free to do that to the masses in the first place. No one has the free will to drop an atomic bomb in New York City. Or London, for that matter. It could happen. But if it happens, it means that we're vulnerable. It's not because he did that and we don't deserve it. Right? That's not the way it works. Could be different with individuals. Could be that one individual harming another individual. It could be that you could foist your will on someone else, even to the tune that they don't deserve. But not in the political system, and not at the level of masses, and not at the level of somebody who has that type of political power. So the face that's on the stamp, if you like, or the poster, or the whatever it is, that the one who wins the election, let's say, that is not really what determines what's going to happen. If it is a person who wins that position, who looks scary, who doesn't appear to be as good as it could be for us, for the people, for Israel, for the Jews, that is a message to us. That's a message to us. It could be a wake-up call. We could be an event to sensitize us. But it's a tragic error to look to him as opposed to looking to the forces that made it necessary for that person to be there at that time. The Torah attitude would be that to look at a person and blame him, or be afraid of him, or put your faith in him, would be as silly as when a person hits a dog with a stick and the dog turns around and bites the stick. Dog doesn't understand that there's a hand that wields the stick. In fact, it's no accident that the Talmud says that in the pre-Messianic era, the political system of the time, the people of the time, the generation, the Talmud says, will have the face of a dog. Face of a dog. What does it mean? Talmud describes 7 years leading up to the Messianic advent, the process of Messianic revelation. It talks about many things, what will happen to the Jewish people, what will happen in the world, many detailed predictions. But one of them is, it says that the generation will have the Pnei Hador K'Pnei HaKelev. The face of the generation will be the face of a dog. What does that mean? There are many interpretations, deep interpretations. But one of them is that a dog doesn't understand. It will be a generation that when it's beaten, or when events transpire in that generation, instead of looking to the real cause, that there's a high and deep hand behind the scenes that manipulates events, moving history to its final conclusion, people will short-sightedly look at the immediate cause. A political leader, or a vote, or immediate causes, without seeing that there's a hand that moves things behind the scenes, and certainly not looking to themselves as the real cause of what generates what happens. That's one interpretation. There's another one, which is Yochanan Wasserman used to say this, and this is, of course, very fundamental to understand, because it gives us insight into the whole democratic system. And that is, one characteristic of a dog is that a dog always runs ahead. When you take a dog for a walk, the dog always runs ahead of you. But he's always looking back to see which way you're going. In other words, the leaders of the generation that greets Mashiach will be the kind of people who strut and pose at the heads of nations, but they're looking back to see what the voters want them to do. The very opposite of leadership. You have to understand this deeply. You take your dog for a walk, the dog runs miles ahead of you. So the onlooker thinks the dog's leading you. But if you take a turn, the dog doubles back and then he runs down the new road that you've chosen. So he looks like he's leading, but actually very deeply he's following. In the democratic system, the way it works is that the leader actually is not a leader at all. There could be no deeper example of a follower than a democratic leader. But the reason is that he's only there because the people have put him there. He hasn't led them and taught them and uplifted them. They've made him who he is. But not only that, he's gotten there by trying to echo what he thinks they, in Western democracies today, the situation has sunk so low that Western democratic leaders appealing for office don't even pretend to have a position. They don't even pretend to take a view or to be leaders. They say openly that they take positions that they think the electorate wants. Sometimes it has a thin guise of being, well, that's my job. My job is, after all, to represent the people. So if the people think abortion is fine, so then I'm for abortion. If people think that mixed, same-sex marriages are fine, then I'm for same-sex. That means he doesn't have an opinion. If he does sort of have an opinion because he has a religious background or some sort of opinion that he expressed in the past, it can be a great embarrassment. Because he has to sort of double back on that and say he doesn't really hold it, and only when he belonged to that church. Now he doesn't. In other words, he's taking a line that is what he thinks the voters want to hear. I mean, just understand, in Judaism, the concept of a leader is a person who has royalty. That means that he does what's right. He does what's right because he has the power and the strength and the moral conviction to do what's right. He teaches people. Right? The ideal Torah system, the Mashiach will be a monarchy. It will be a king. Of course, today democracy is a lot better alternative than the other options. Right? Today, if you put somebody, if today you put a political leader into a power of autonomous, autocratic leadership, it would be total bloodbath. I mean, we've seen what's happened in the last couple of centuries when people reach the kind of power where they have no answerability to the people. Right? That is so deeply corrupting that there's no hope for that. No hope at all. Democracy is far better than that. But the problem with a democratic system, the benefit of a democratic system, is that it has the kind of checks and balances that keeps everything more or less stable. Unfortunately, stable at the lowest common denominator. And perhaps that's the best we can have at this point in time. But the leader certainly isn't a leader. He's a victim of the people. He's put in front of the people, but he's echoing only what the people want, and he's completely bound by what they want, and there's not even a pretense that it's different. So that is the Torah's insulting way of looking at political leaders who think they have real power, pose and strut and behave as if they are royalty, but in fact they have no content, no real positions, no real views, and if there are, those are set aside in terms of what's expedient. That's a real travesty of Jewish leadership, Jewish terms. Furthermore, anybody who wants political power is extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous. When you look at leadership from a Torah perspective, God has always chosen, Hashem has always chosen people, the last thing they wanted was to be a leader. The last thing they wanted. When Hashem speaks to Moshe Rabbeinu and he says, I've chosen you, go and save the Jewish people, Moshe Rabbeinu argues with him for 7 days. Argues with God, not his buddy, or opinion in the newspaper. He argues with Hashem, I'm the wrong man, you made a mistake, I can't do it. Hashem says, well, I respect your opinion, but I'm God, and I say you can do it. Moshe says, no, you got the wrong man, I'm incapable, I can't speak properly. Finally, after 7 days argument, Hashem starts to get a little irritated, as it were, a little angry, and he's forced into taking the job. That's the way a leader should be elected. Any political system that had any sense, that the people they would immediately exclude are those who want to be leaders. What intelligence is there in electing somebody who wants to be who wants power over you? He's not interested in your benefit. He wants the power. What more dangerous move could there be? If they had any sense, they would find a person of sage, wise years, who's happy sitting in a mountaintop retreat somewhere, developing himself spiritually, totally allergic to the public eye and to leadership and to public greatness. And they would force him to be a leader. They would take some spiritual giant who's developed a real defeat of his ego, and they would insist. They would threaten him with murder and make him their leader. Or they choose people who want power, openly lust for power, ready to kill for it, and often do, whose decisions will be to send young people off to war that they won't participate in, on a whim. Nothing could be more foolish. And therefore you see that the criterion for Torah leadership, the first criterion for leadership in Torah, is that a person doesn't want it. He thinks he's incapable. He has to be forced into it. And the second criterion is that he doesn't lead others, he takes the responsibility for them. Hashem chose all his leaders because they were shepherds, and they had to prove themselves by putting their life on the line for little sheep. Even a single lost sheep. That's a criterion for leadership. When the 70 elders were chosen in the desert, when the Jewish people were going through the desert, and Moshe Rabbeinu complained to Hashem that I can't carry this people alone, which was a mistake, incidentally. He was capable. Hashem showed him that he was. But Hashem consented to let him have 70 leaders that would lead with him, and so he could delegate authority. Who was chosen? The people who were chosen to be leaders were the people who in Egypt had taken the beatings that were meant to be given to the Jewish people. When the Egyptians, just like the Germans, right, when they wanted the Jewish people to produce a certain amount of produce, whatever it was, they put Jewish taskmasters over them and threatened them if their subjects didn't produce. So what happened was that these taskmasters who were appointed Jews, who were appointed over other Jews, when their subjects were unable to meet the quotas that they had to meet, they took the beatings. Right? They didn't step back and say, well, it's not my fault, it's his problem. They took the punishment. That's a leader. A leader isn't somebody who sends you off to war to die because it suits him. A leader is a person who makes sure you're safe, and he takes the rap. Right? A real shepherd is someone who's not concerned about himself, but concerned about you. The people who became elected to Jewish leadership, the 70 elders of the Jewish people, were people who didn't put themselves forward to be leaders, riding on the backs of the people that were under them. These were people who were prepared to be beaten to death if necessary, to protect the people that they were responsible for. So I hope you begin to see a picture emerging of what a Jewish leader should look like. Furthermore, he has to be a person of tremendous courage and conviction. He has to be so courageous that even if everybody says different than him, he doesn't change his view. My son told me a story this evening about a father took his son for a walk in the woods, and they came to a little stream, and in the stream there were hundreds, thousands of fish. And the father said to his son, how do you tell which ones are alive? So the kid looked at the water and he said, gee, I don't know, there's thousands of fish. The father said, look carefully, and the boy said, yeah, the ones who are swimming upstream, they're going to be alive. That's absolutely right. The dead ones just float downstream. You want to know who's alive? It's the ones swimming against the current. And an absolute criterion for Jewish leadership and Jewish greatness and heroism is that you can go against the stream, even if everybody else isn't. You see this in so many ways. We read this week about Avraham Avinu, right? About Abraham. He was the original Jewish leader, founder. We all descend from him, literally, one way or another, certainly spiritually. His unique characteristic, he was called Avram Avery. That means he stood on one side while the whole world stood on another. The whole world stood on one side and he stood on one. I mean, he was prepared to stand against the world. Not only that, they tried to kill him for that. The world in that generation was completely united around a king called Nimrod. Nimrod means rebellion. That means, the Gemara says his name means knowing God and rebelling against him. He was the unifying force that got the whole world together. And in fact, they were totally unified. They spoke one language. They Dvarim Achadim. It was a culture, not like today, it was an empire. It was a world empire then. It wasn't like one empire against others. Right? There was a united, it's true there was a war of 4 kings against 5 kings in his generation. That also needs to be understood, because that was the first war in history. Very relevant subject to understand what war means. Very peculiar thing, war. But when it came to building the tower that they wanted to build to reach the center of the universe so they could take control over the world, they were completely united. In fact, the reason they tried to kill him was because he opposed him. You see, what happened was that their success depended on their being completely united. What they were trying to do, you know that it was a generation that built, it says, Iru Migdal. They tried to build a city and a tower. This tower, we call it Tower of Babel, right? Bavel. This tower was an attempt to reach, again, not to think of this in childish terms. The way children are taught is it was a tower of bricks. They hoped to build it so high they would reach God, and they would fight against him. Understand, this is not, when you're 6 years old, that's okay, but obviously something much deeper. What they were really trying to build was Ir Umigdal in Torah always means, a city and a tower always means the only city and the only tower. The city is always Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, and the tower is always the Beis HaMikdash. Migdal David Savarech, like the tower of your neck. The Migdal always means the temple is a place which is the point of contact between this world and the next. If you wanted to reach into the spiritual world and make contact with God, if you could, a tower of bricks isn't going to do it. At least high and high and higher. The way you do that is you build a structure that has the potential to reach the center of the world. That's what the temple is. What is the Beis HaMikdash? What is found in the temple? That's the place where Hashem is met. That's where you meet him. In the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, when the Kohen Gadol goes in, this is the place where the voice of Hashem speaks from. The Talmud calls it the place where heaven and earth kiss. That means where the higher world can be accessed from the lower world. That's what they tried to build Yerushalayim and the Beis HaMikdash on the dark side, not on the good side. They wanted to use it to get into the center of the world and detach it from its spiritual source. How could they do that? They very nearly did. They weren't idiots. These were very great people. Very evil, but very great. The plan was to reconstitute the united force that was Adam. If they could all reunite, how did the world begin? The world began with a man and woman, who were single individuals, who were cosmic in their greatness. They were the size of the universe. Adam was the size of the universe. Right? He had a body made of light. He occupied the planets and the stars before he was shrunk after the sin. And his tool was language. The tool of creation was language. How did God create the world? Vayomer Elokim, it says. And Hashem said. It doesn't mean he gave instructions or made announcements. It means when he uttered a word, his word was creation. In Hebrew, the word davar means a word and also means a thing. Because every object in the world is a crystallized, condensed, divine word. Hashem created the world by speaking it into existence. Every word that he uttered became a thing in the world. So the tool of creation, the nuclear energy, if you like, that creates the world, is a speech of Hashem. So these people, and Adam had the power to recreate the world in his image. He did. So their rationale was, let's reconstitute Adam. That means if we all unite as his children, and we are totally single-minded, and we can bond it to one human mass, speaking the original prophetic language of creation, we can recreate the world in our image. They weren't wrong. They were right that is the tool. You see it because the response was, Hashem said, let us go down and babble their language. Now, obviously Hashem's attacking them on their own turf. Their tool was to be the language of creation, and therefore Hashem destroyed their language. It doesn't mean, see again, children are taught that, they all spoke Hebrew. And then Hashem came down and he zapped them so that now one was speaking Zulu, one was speaking Chinese, one was speaking South Korean. They couldn't understand each other, so the whole... Doesn't mean that. They were still speaking Hebrew. They were no longer speaking the language of creation, where two people understand each other perfectly, where they are thinking the same thing, where you can't misunderstand. That means he damaged their language to the point that they sound like we sound. Where two people speak to each other now, there's no hope of understanding each other, even though they're speaking the same language. The only way today we ever have a hope of communicating is when you don't have to speak. If you know somebody well enough that half a gesture is good enough and they understand you, they've got a chance of understanding. But you have to start explaining. The more you explain, the less hope there is to communicate what you really mean. But before they spoke a united language, and that was the language of creation. And the idea was to reunite into one human mass of all humanity, which would represent again what Adam was, the original man. And then using the language, the united Safa Achat, it says, they were one Dvarim Achadim, they spoke the original language, they'd be able to recreate the world. And they weren't wrong that their unity was the correct tool. Where do we see that? Where do we see that? How do we see that you can make contact with the source of reality when you're united? Because when the Torah was given, that's what the Jewish people did. That's exactly what they did. When the Jewish people came to Sinai, the Torah suddenly switches from the plural into the singular. Instead of saying they about the Jewish people, it says Vayichan Sham Neged Ahar, and he camped there. Meaning the Jewish people, Rashi says, Ish Echad Belev Echad, like one person with one heart. When enough Jews get together, then they constitute a mass of power that can bring Hashem's presence into the world. The Talmud discusses how many people you need. 3 people get together, you have one sort of unity. 10 people get together, you have a minyan, it's another whole spiritual power. 22,000 people get together, it's another whole level. And the Shekhinah can manifest, Hashem can manifest on earth. You can, as it were, invite him to manifest in the world when enough people, not because masses of people, more is better than less. That's not the point. More is better than less when more are one. So these people decided to unify themselves into one mass, using the language of creation, and then they could build this tower that would reach the center of the world. And the problem was there was one individual who disagreed. His name was Avram. He's called Avram HaIvri. Ivri means he stands on one side. And he opposed the world culture. Not like he had the heroism to oppose, the Chinese, government and stand in front of the tanks. I mean, that's massive. But this was world culture. Not one nation, not one empire. They were totally united. The whole world at that time, right, was all united in one geographic location. You know that. The southernmost extent of humanity then was somewhere Ethiopia. And the easternmost extension was some part of Asia. England, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but this wasn't even yet inhabited by blue-painted savages. The only place outside of that where there was real culture, of course, was South Africa. But that's history. But that's well known. But the point is that the entire universe, where all humans lived, was united. And he opposed the whole culture of the world. He wasn't fazed by the fact that they threatened to kill him and they tried to kill him. They threw him into a furnace. Nimrod threw him into a fire because he opposed the project. By the way, why did that deserve death? The answer was they needed human unity. They needed everybody. As soon as there'd be a dissenting opinion, you don't have unity. And the only reason they didn't kill him because they couldn't. He survived miraculously in the furnace, in the fire. And then their response was, they said, Preda zu akarahi. This old donkey is sterile. He was a very old man. He and his wife had no children. And since they couldn't kill him, they took the line that, we'll wait till he's irrelevant. Because since he doesn't have progeny, he's one individual, he and his wife. And they oppose us, but they'll die. He's old, but he'll die. And then we'll have the world to ourselves. It's true there were others who didn't take that line of thinking. Shem and Aver had a yeshiva where they were teaching Torah at the same time. Interesting question about why there was no attempt to kill them. I guess a subject for another time. But essentially he stood against the world culture. The fact that they all said he was wrong, they argued with him philosophically, brutally, militarily, they tried to kill him, made no difference to him. Not only that, he won people over to his way of thinking. Took responsibility for others too. Not only was he convinced about the truth of he had a philosophical debate with the king of Nimrod. The reason Nimrod threw him into fire was because he lost the debate. Nimrod said that he worshipped the sun, so Abraham Avinu said, well, the clouds are more powerful, so he worshipped the clouds. He said the wind's more powerful, it blows the clouds away. He kept trapping him into philosophical contradictions. Eventually he won the argument by throwing him into a fire. That's how they argue, the autocrats. And he wasn't afraid to stand against the world. So another criterion for Jewish greatness and leadership is that if you're the only fish swimming against the stream, you have to have strength of character to do that. It's very hard. It's very hard. It's not only a question of courage, it's also a question of intellectual courage. Because you live in a world where your thought patterns are conditioned. It isn't only that everybody says be immoral and you know it's wrong. Your own head is perverted by their immorality. The tools of thought you have are theirs. How Jewishly do you think? We don't think Jewishly. We think in a very non-Jewish, Christian, Western, technological, atheistic, limited, finite, non-spiritual way. That's how we think. So we have to be heroic enough to think like Jews when the very thought processes are being contaminated. And he managed when he was 3 years old. The Medrash says when he was 3 he began to figure it out. Before that he was an idolater himself. His family taught him that. His father sold idols. He first had to go against his own father. The famous Medrash says, as a little child, he walked into his father's shop one day when his father was out and he smashed all the idols. And he left the hammer in the hand of the biggest idol that he didn't smash. When his father came in, he said, "What's going on?" He said, "It wasn't me, it was him." So his father said, "Don't be a fool, he's made out of stone." So he said to his father, "So why do you worship him?" And that's when his father handed him over to Nimrod. So, those are some of the conditions. Let's take one more step. It doesn't end there. He had another level of courage as well. This week's Parsha puts it like this. Hashem said to him, "Lech lecha," go from your home, your birthplace, your father's house, your land of your birth. Ela aretz asher areka. Listen carefully, it's amazing discussion here. Amazing. So the Gemara and the commentaries say, although the various commentaries enumerate the 10 tests that he was put to in different ways, but this all agree was the first one. This is the first test he was given. Hashem said to him, leave all that's familiar. Leave your birthplace, your father's house, your country of birth, and go to the land which I will show you. That's a very interesting test. Because the test works like this. There's a clarity in it, and there's a doubt and a darkness. The clarity is that he knows exactly what he has to do. He knows exactly. The instructions couldn't be plainer. Leave your father's house, your birthplace, everything that's familiar, your social circle. No mistake about what he has to do. And it's a prophetic voice. We're not talking about a young fellow who woke up one morning and sort of thought it would be nice to, do something different. We're talking about prophetic voice. Can't get clearer than that. But the result, that means the destination, complete darkness. To the land which I'll show you. When you get there, you'll see. What's the meaning of this? Again, if Hashem speaks to him prophetically, he doesn't want him to figure it out himself. He tells him clearly what I want from you. But then tell him clearly where to go. So Hashem tells him clearly what he wants. That means that he has to get moving. But when he wants him to go, he doesn't say. The normal instruction for a journey, when you tell someone to travel, the really important part of the instruction is the destination. Where you leave is hardly relevant. If I want you to meet me at a certain place and time, I specify the destination. Where you leave from is your own problem. Well, what kind of instruction is it? I tell you exactly where to leave, I don't tell you where to go. What instruction is that? You want a man to undertake a journey. The only thing that's important is to specify the destination. You want to specify the point of departure? Fine. Maybe it's important for some reason, but you tell him where he's going. And obviously Hashem wants him to see it clearly because he tells him prophetically. But the most important part of the instruction he doesn't say. What's going on? But the nature of a Jewish test and the nature of Jewish greatness is that all of our tests in depth are things where the instruction to move and to develop and to move beyond yourself has to be clear. It's not a Jewish thing to leap off cliffs and declare that you're born again and sort of hypnotically take on. They're very unreliable. We always begin with clarity, whether the clarity is prophetic in the era of prophecy, whether it's examination of Jewish history, whether it's philosophical clarity, whether it's evidence-based investigation. It's always like that. How does Jewish investigation begin? We sit people down and we start learning. And the Jewish learning process is a very critical, analytical process. We don't say to people, sit down and chant until you're mindless. Eat rhubarb and sit in a stone slab and meditate for 8 hours until you're numb. We don't do that. That has value too. There's value too, meditation. But we say start asking questions. You can afford to do that when you're dealing with the truth. And we train people to be very critically analytical. There's no holds barred on Jewish questions. If there is a limitation, it's only the tone of the question. There's nothing you can't ask in Jewish investigation, provided you're asking for an answer. If you're asking to prove that the person you're speaking to is wrong, that's not a question. If you're asking aggressively to prove your point, that's not a question. But if you're asking sincerely to hear an answer, there's no question you can't ask. Nothing else off limits. The Rambam himself discusses how do we know there's a God in the first place, let alone our version of what God's supposed to be. Perfectly legitimate question. How do we know the Torah was given? How do you know it's binding? How do you know its details? How do you know it's accurate? All legitimate questions. So we start with logical analysis, with clarity. You have to get as clear as you can. But then there comes a time in the journey when you have to leap off the cliff and you can't see the other side. The nature of a Jewish test, Jewish greatness is, the invitation to move has to be clear. To start changing your life and becoming a bold tshuva, somebody who redefines his life and moves back to his sources because you sort of vaguely think it's a good idea. Very unreliable, that. What's the difference between that and some other cultish, immature motivation? It has to be better than that. But once you've made that decision, the destination cannot be seen. You can't see the destination. And the reason is because the destination is who you will be when you get there. So understand this deeply, it's an amazing thing. Lech lecha means, the simple translation is go for yourself. This journey will be good for you. But the literal translation is go unto yourself. What is the destination? The destination isn't only another land, it's another state of being. It means Hashem is saying to him, cast off where you live now, leap off the cliff. And I can't show you the other side, because the ground on the other side is what you will form when you get there. Again, we're talking about a spiritual journey. The spiritual journey means you have to destroy who you are. You have to shatter your limitations to reach a state of greater dimensions. But you can't see what that is. If you have a person trapped in a piece of glass, somebody's frozen in a glass prison, and you shine light on the individual, the more light you shine, the more it keeps breaking up into the colors. He'll never see the white light until he breaks the prison. The heroism of a spiritual journey always is that before you can ever feel the satisfaction and the security of the destination, is you have to break where you're at. Unless you can break the bonds of your immaturity, you can't become a more mature individual. And the reason is not because Hashem doesn't want to show him. If Hashem would show him what he's going to be when he's bigger, he'll shrink it. Imagine you speak to a 5-year-old and you say to the 5-year-old, you know what you're going to be like when you're 25? And you give the child a full description, an eloquent, detailed description of what he's going to be like when he's 25. He thinks you mean more ice cream. More sweets. He's incapable. Only when he's broken these limitations, then you won't have to explain to him. So when Hashem comes to Avraham Avinu and says to him, I want you to leap into the new being that you will become, at an incredible level of prophecy and closeness to me, you can't explain what that is now. He keeps shrinking it into the distorted, immature vision that he has now. Therefore Hashem says to him, look, when you get there you'll see what it is, because it'll be you. That's heroic. That's heroic. Tonight when you're walking out of here, lost in thought I hope, imagine a big hand taps you, a big hand. You turn around and you find you're speaking to the creator of the world. I mean, if it happens to you, see me privately, because you'll need help. But and you say, Hashem, and Hashem says, yeah, I'd like you to do me a favor. And you say, and Hashem says, I want you to take a little trip down to the mountains tomorrow. And I want you to climb up to the highest peak, and I want you to leap. Just leap. But I'll be there to catch you. I promise you. Well, you're not imagining this. You're talking to Hashem himself. Yeah? Prophecy is far clearer than anything you can begin to imagine. If there's anything you know, it's this. That's truth. Tomorrow morning you take that trip, don't you? I mean, Hashem. And you walk over to the edge and you go, and you say, no. That's a test. Because the fact that you have to make this leap is not something you made up. In fact, if you wake up in the morning and you think, you know what, I'll go down to the mountains today and I'll... An idiot. That's not spiritual greatness, that's spiritual foolishness. He didn't decide to leap off into the unknown because he thought it was a good idea. He had clear instruction. a sensible path of development is where the facts are clear to you. Whatever the facts are, it's your investigation, it's people you admire that are obviously more mature than you, that see a depth in it. It's your own first taste, it's your own, whatever it is, has to be clear. Today we have a very limited clarity, we don't have prophecy today. So we take small snaps, very small jumps. But you have the clarity, and then you come to the edge of the cliff and it's not, you can't see the other side. Of course you can't see the other side, it's what you will be. So the ordeal is made up of two opposite components. One component is complete clarity. The other component is complete blindness and darkness. You know, sometimes people say, it's an accusation you sometimes say. You say, you know, you religious individuals, you have it so easy. You argue with a secular thinker. They say, yeah, so easy. Your life is mapped out. You've got blinkers. You follow religious strictures. Got no thinking to do, no heroism, no exploration. So all ritualistic and rote. The words you say in the prayers are all mapped out for you. Every action you do is laid out in the code of Jewish law. How you cut your fingernails, how you tie your shoelaces, how you live intimately with your spouse, how you handle yourself in the bathroom. There's no effort. It's all mapped out. Mindless. No heroism. But me, I'm a secular person. I go wherever truth calls. I have no limitations. Wherever the truth defines reality, that's where I go. The truth's exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite. And this person's blind to it. The truth is that a really spiritual individual is using a formula, is using tools that are clear. Of course he has to be doing that. Why ignore them? When the tools are there and time tested and trusted and established, the tools are there. They are laid down. But where these tools take you is completely heroic. What you will be tomorrow, even the simplest version of a real Baal Tshuva who takes on this obligation to become closer to his Jewish sources, you really understand what this will do to your family relationships and your friendships and all your whole world of entertainment and value. And not only that, the people that were close to you not only will drift away, they will scorn you, laugh at you and heap scorn on your head. Who knows how difficult it will be? Who knows how much you'll have to sacrifice? But you're going where the truth leads. That's really going where the truth leads. You see what the result is, how difficult it'll be, where you'll end up, what benefit you'll have in it, you don't begin to see. So the spiritual path is a path of real heroism, where there are no limits at all. Who knows what you'll discover tomorrow when you're 100 miles down the road? Who knows what you'll be invited to? But the secularist, the one who claims that he goes wherever the truth leads, whether the truth leads, provided it's within his boundaries. After all, he defines himself as secular. That means as long as I can understand it. This great hero who tells you that he goes wherever the truth leads, as long as it's finite, of course, within the realm of what I can understand. No leaps into places that I can't see. And therefore, you understand that the journey is... And the work that's involved is the work of loyalty. That means there's a calling and a truth that's apparent. What the results of that will be, what the journey will mean, what you will become, what the destination will look like, you don't see that at all. But you're doing this because it's true. To the extent that you see it at this point in time. And therefore, that's another hallmark of Jewish heroism, Torah greatness. Right? It requires a tremendous, almost indescribably great meshing of two characteristics. One is unbelievable heroism. To take a leap like that. That means to use all your power in a leap, and at the same time to give up your ego completely. I have no idea where this will result. This is up to you. That's why that process requires an indescribable partnership. The partnership has two components, two equal components. Me and him. Me because he invites me to leap. You know, the Jewish definition of the ordeal, Hashem doesn't say go and stand on the mountaintop and then a great wind will raise you and blow you across to the other side. No. Hashem says jump. And if you jump inadequately, you're going to crash into the ravine with the jagged rocks. You know, if you want the real picture, it's like Hashem says jump across. And you say, well, you know, there's mist over there. I can't see the other side. The mist begins about like 10 steps from here. I've never jumped more than 9 before. And Hashem says, yep, I know. You jump the 9, I'll carry you across the 10th. Well, you say, well, how do I know? You know, so you take a little experiment, you go some place safe on the side, you carefully mark out the 10, you leap, you make 9. Try harder, you make 9.001. come back to the edge and there's 10 steps to leap. And Hashem says, yep, you're right, I know you're capable of 9. But if you do the 9, I'll carry you across the 10th. But if you jump 8.9, you're going to crash. How can I help you? So you have to evince every inch, every ounce, every hair's breadth of all your personal greatness. You don't lie in bed and I say, Hashem, make me great, while I read the newspaper. You get given Torah wisdom to the extent that you extend yourself beyond all description. You have to kill yourself for it. The Gemara says you have to kill that. The Torah expression is Adam ki yamut bo'el, a person who dies in a tent. That means the deep interpretation is a person who dies in the tent of Torah is to become dead to the rest of the world. He has only eyes for this. It has to be a love sickness that goes beyond description. So now leaving it to God. Jewish trust doesn't mean, it's all up to him. If he wants, yes. If he doesn't want, no. No, that's not Jewish approach. Jewish approach is you have to leap. You have to leap with absolute, total expression of everything that you are. Absolute focus and concentration. And yet the leap won't be enough. The answer is, if you do your part, he carries you over the rest. So what happens when you get there? You take that heroic leap, summoning all the power at your disposal, and asserting yourself with every fiber of your being. And then what happens is, you find yourself across the 10. So what happened? There were two heroes here, or two components. There was the human greatness that leapt, at the same time as asserting itself in greatness, dissolving ego. You have to have a completely schizoid approach. You have to stand there and say, I'm going to do it, and I'm great, and I can do it, and I can reach my maximum. And you assert yourself with total assertion of self, at the same time as saying, but I'm completely incapable of getting to the 10th. That's up to you. It's a completely schizoid approach. The whole Jewish approach to life is that schizoid approach. You have to go out and earn a living. Your attitude has to be, I'm functioning totally responsibly. Total honesty, total focus on the job, total loyalty to an employer, to a job. And yet, every penny that comes in is a complete gift. The Rambam says a doctor has to treat a patient that way. It's every profession. He has to stand back from the bedside and say, whatever I do here makes no difference. If the patient's going to live, he's going to live. He's going to die. I'm completely irrelevant. And then the doctor has to step forward and treat the patient as if every breath depends on him only. Schizoid. Getting married. You have to say, I'm going to make an effort to meet the right person. An effort, whatever effort's required. Or the discussion of how much you have to do. The result, not up to you. Not up to you. Who's presented to you at the right time and place, you're not in control of. All you can do is, so you have to make a responsible effort, correctly, with all the Torah parameters of how you have to do that, and know that the result's not you. There are cults in the world, and sects and religions, especially in the East, that teach that it's all about doing nothing. Completely, not just ego, but nothing at all. The less you do, the better. And there's truth in that, because the less you do, the more you can break ego. But Judaism requires a paradoxical assertion of self and destruction of ego at the same time. A real servant of God is not a person who says, God, Hashem, I'm yours, do whatever you want with me. A person who claims to be your slave and comes up to you and says, I'm your slave, push me, pull me, do whatever you want. It's not a slave, that's just a nuisance. A real slave is a person who comes to you and says, I'm burning with ambition. I want to achieve everything I can achieve and enjoy it as well. But I want to do it for you. That's a slave. A real servant of Hashem is not somebody who says, Hashem, I'm just nothing. Makes no difference to me. You want to kill me, kill me. A real servant of Hashem is a person who's burning with ambition and wants to use every instant of his life to the maximum. And enjoy it, because it's not healthy if you're not enjoying it. A real love has to be enjoyed too. A real love is defined totally by the other, not by self. But if the self isn't enjoying it, it's not love. And therefore, a person who really loves Hashem, who wants to be a servant of Hashem, is somebody who wants to manifest himself completely. There's no nook or cranny of his being that won't be expressed. But there's no ego in it. That's a very hard exercise. Very hard exercise. A person is really manifesting a love in a love relationship. It's all done because of the love for the other. But it's all done. It's all me expressing myself. And richly enjoying it as well. But the focus is you, not me. And therefore, that's Jewish greatness. It has to be looking for people who are leaders, who have the character and the strength of conviction and character to be able to go through whatever's necessary. There's no question of compromise. There's no compromise at all. Wherever the truth leads. With the heroism to be able to assert oneself, and the greatness to be able to dissolve the ego. That's who we're looking at. So we find ourselves in a system that is exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite. There's no real leadership. There's the voice of the masses, which are the lowest common denominator, where people aren't qualified at all. They don't even know what the issues are. Voting for people who know even less. Who are looking only to wield power over those that they can wield power over, take advantage of, and tax for their own personal greatness. Very, very dangerous situation. So what we studied this evening is that when we find ourselves in a political system, a democratic system, let's start to train Torah eyes to see where the real center is, what real greatness is, that the leaders we get are what we deserve. Really, we generate that not because we voted. You have to vote, but you have to vote schizoid too. You have to vote because it's ishtadlus, meaning vote's an obligation, like earning a living, but not because it makes a difference. What makes a difference in the end is what we need and what we deserve. That has to be changed. Much more potent than voting is changing yourself. So you take responsibility for changing yourself and really growing and really developing and being a leader in that sense. Much more potent leadership emanates from the genuine nature of who you are. Real leaders are not in Judaism people who set out to be leaders. Those people are despicable. People who want to be honored. There's nothing more humiliating than wanting someone to honor you. Wanting someone to honor you. The Maharal says, the Gemara says that honor only comes to those who flee from it. Honor only comes to those who flee from it. Because anyone who chases honor, it flees from him. So Maharal says, you know what the meaning is? Because there's nothing more humiliating than chasing honor. Of course it runs away. You're chasing it away. Honor me, please. Honor me. Put an advert in the paper saying how great you are, that you pay for. Send yourself a admiring card and, put up posters about this. Therefore, a person who chases honor is chasing it away. A person who genuinely flees from honor. One man came to the Chazon Ish and he said, Rabbi, I've been fleeing honor all my life and it still hasn't found me. The Chazon Ish said to him, Besias, you're looking over your shoulder, that's a problem. You have to genuinely not want it, not run away so that it finds you. That's even more humiliating. And a Jewish leader is a person who builds himself. He rides his own little wagon along the road, and finally, sometime down the road, he looks back and there's a few other nebuch individuals hanging onto the back of your wagon who think you have something to teach them. That's a beginning approach, and it couldn't be more appropriate that in this week of Lech Lecha, which is the beginning of the journey, of an individual who developed himself for greatness, with complete destruction of ego, and at the same time, complete concern is midavos chesed, that means complete kindness, only worrying about spreading that, sharing that truth that he found. And ultimately, that's the individual who became arguably the greatest individual of all time and the greatest leader. Okay, we'll stop there.